Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analysts will be listing out the top 5 compositions for patch 1010. The meta is still evolving daily, so which compositions make the top 5 today aren't necessarily what's going to be best in the next few days. With that said, today's compositions are some of the more consistent ones in the meta currently, so let's jump into it. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back into the video, and to kick off things, we've got Cybernetics coming in at number 5. Okay, so Cybernetics, specifically 6 Cybernetics, has fallen off a little bit over the course of the last few patches. It's certainly not as consistent as it once was and can struggle to get a top 2 placement, but overall it's still doing well because Cybernetic trait itself is flexible in the late game and has a great early and mid game as well. Another benefit is the flexibility of the items you can use for the build, as the only champion with somewhat specific requirements is Aurelia. The core champions of Cybernetics are the usual 6 Cybernetics with 2 common paths at level 8. Either you can add in Chrono and Mana Reaver with Shen and Thresh, or you can play KAYLE with Misfortune for Blade Master and Valkyrie. The latter is less reliable due to the overlap of Misfortune and Echo's abilities, but generally you can work around that with a tier item on one or the other. Your win condition late game is going to be Aurelia 3, but if you're playing Misfortune, she can become another win condition with full mercenary upgrades. Items, as mentioned, are quite flexible for Cybernetics. Red buff is one of the strongest options on Lucian, and mainly defensive or utility items given to the rest of them. Aurelia is the only champion you're going to want to aim for specific items, with Infinity Edge, Last Whisper, and Deathblade all being viable options. Deathcap can also be used instead of Infinity Edge, as they equal about the same amount of damage, though both are weak against compositions with high armor. Next up in our top 5 list is MECH Infiltrator, coming in at number 4. Despite this composition receiving nerfs multiple patches in a row, it still remains to be one of the best builds in the meta. It is much less consistent than it was in previous metas, but when uncontested and played well, it's still able to easily get a top 3 placement. But if those conditions aren't met, it's much harder to pull it off in 1010 than it was previously. Core champions are all 3 of the mech pilots, with the goal being to 3-star at least Annie and Rumble. Kai'Sa remains the priority infiltrator to 3-star, though Shaco can also do well as a secondary carry. Kha'Zix will be the 4th infiltrator, and while you can replace him later with Echo, keeping him in your composition and 3-starring him is also fine to do. From there, you're going to want to add in Sorcerer and Valkyrie, which usually ends up being Lux and Misfortune. As mentioned, you will want to 3-star at least Annie, Rumble, and Kai'Sa. Defensive items are still best on the Super Mech, with Bramble Vest being the most important. It has also become common to add in 1 or 2 dodge items on the Super Mech, as having a chance to dodge is quite powerful. The core items for Kai'Sa are still Demolitionist Charge, Seraphs, and Morellonomicon, and if you're mainly getting swords, you can use them to itemize Shaco. Overall, the win condition for this composition is partly hitting all the relevant 3-star upgrades, but even more important than that is scouting and positioning. Once you have all 3 mech pilots, you need to begin diligently scouting the other players' positions so that your mech and Kai'Sa are in the most optimal positioning. Position well, and your chances to get a top 3 finish go up dramatically. Alright, moving on to the number 3 build on the list, we have Shredder. Shredder, or Xayah carry, remains one of the best compositions in 1010 and the strongest of the hyper roll builds. Xayah did receive a nerf that lowered her attack damage by 5, but that hasn't been much of a hindrance to her, especially with Deathblade being buffed. Overall, this build is more likely to be contested than other hyper roll builds, so make sure to scout before you roll down for Xayah. Besides Xayah, the core champions are fairly flexible, but you're generally going to want to pick up Caitlyn, Jarvan, and Shen with an additional Blade Master. Look to 3-star Xayah, Caitlyn, and Jarvan. Shen 3 is also an option, but don't prioritize him over the 1-star units. Fiora is also common to run in 3-star, but you don't have to, as she can be replaced later by Aurelia. Later on in the build, you can look to add Ashe, Kassadin, and Rakan for 4 Celestials. Xayah remains the main carry and the only champion you need to worry about having good items for. Last Whisper is still a priority item, as heavy armor frontlines are still common, and to win fights, Xayah needs to shred through the frontline quickly. Infinity Edge pairs well with Last Whisper, but Deathblade has become more of a standard second item as it was buffed in 1010. Lastly, you can play defensive items such as Quicksilver or Tramp Claw, but playing full damage can be viable if you position well. Coming in at number 2 on the list is JINX carry. JINX is still a staple mid and late game 4-cost carry of the meta, though she isn't quite as dominant as she was in 10.9, but she's still quite contested and often ends up in compositions that place in the top 3 consistently. Overall, Brawler Blaster is the more common build to play her in as the carry, but Rebels are still a viable option as well. If you're playing Brawler Blaster, the core champions are all 4 brawlers: JINX, Ezreal, Graves, and Miss Fortune. Early and mid-game Lucian is fine to run, but late-game Graves is preferred because of the utility his ability provides. If you're playing Rebels, the core champions are JINX with 5 other Rebels with Gangplank and Miss Fortune added in at level 8. Generally, JINX won't be the main win condition for any build utilizing her, as both Miss Fortune and Gangplank, when 2-starred with full mercenary upgrades, can carry the late game more consistently than JINX can. One benefit to running JINX as your main carry is how flexible she can be with items. Last Whisper is definitely a priority to help her burn through heavy armor champions, but outside of that, you can give her any of Infinity Edge, Deathblade, Giant Slayer, and Red Buff. Quicksilver and Trapclaw are great defensive items for her, with Guardian Angel being right behind those. If you're playing the Rebels version of the build, you can forego the defensive item and play 3 damage items, as the shielding from the trait is often enough to protect JINX. Miss Fortune is the second item carry, with her items also being varied. Quicksilver is one of the best to prevent her ultimate from being interrupted, and any tier or magic damage items work well to increase her effectiveness. Lastly, if you're playing Rebels, you want to have at least Guardian Angel on Gangplank to guarantee his ultimate goes off at least once. And the composition coming in at number 1 on the list, we have KAYLE carry. Much like JINX, KAYLE remains the premier mid to late game 4-cost carry. KAYLE's strength is her versatility in both items and compositions, as you can give her many combinations of items and place her into many different builds. All you need to have to play KAYLE, besides the KAYLE herself, is to utilize both Blade Master and Valkyrie. After that, you can add a plethora of other champions and traits. Let's focus on the most common composition you're going to run KAYLE in: Chrono Blade Master. The core champions are KAYLE, Shen, and Xayah for Blade Master, with Miss Fortune being added in late game for Valkyrie. Thresh, Wukong, and Ezreal will give you 4 Chrono, and Kassadin is added in for both Mana Reaver and Celestial. Another variation of this build drops 2 Chrono and adds in 2 Celestial. Items for KAYLE are flexible, though generally you're going to want to have at least 1 attack speed item and 1 defensive item. The most common are Rageblade and Guardian Angel, though Quicksilver or Trapclaw can be used instead of the Guardian Angel. From there, you can play for damage items like Morellonomicon and Deathcap, or additional attack speed and utility with Rapid Fire Cannon. One other option is giving KAYLE some type of on-hit healing like Gunblade or Hand of Justice. In general, the win condition for KAYLE late game is either KAYLE 3 or Miss Fortune 2 with full mercenary upgrades. Both options can win games, so it mostly comes down to which of those you're able to find late game. All in all, KAYLE is one of the most consistent mid to late game carries. Alright, that is it for our top 5 compositions. But before we go, there's one more thing we want to talk about, and that's honorable mentions. Today's honorable mentions feature 2 hyper role compositions. First up, let's talk about Candyland. Candyland did receive nerfs to both Poppy and Twisted Fate, so overall it's not as consistent as it was in 10.9. That said, if you're able to quickly 3-star both Poppy and Twisted Fate, this build can do well enough to earn you a top 4 placement. The core champions are Poppy and Twisted Fate, with Leona and Zoe being the other 1-cost champions that you're aiming to 3-star. Leona doesn't have to be 3-starred, as she can be replaced later with another Vanguard, usually Wukong. After that, the most common route to take this composition is 6 Sorcerer, with the late game win condition being either Xerath 2 or at level 9 Gangplank 2 with mercenary upgrades. The second honorable mention hyper role composition is Ziggs. Ziggs 3 proved to be a strong option for 1010 as long as you're able to find 4 tiers to give him. But there was a hot fix to Ziggs that lowered his damage at level 3 to 550 from 700. He's still effective with double Seraphs, but much less oppressive to play against than he was at the beginning of the patch. So along with Ziggs 3, you generally roll to find Malphite 3. Both Yasuo and Sona can also be rolled for, but don't prioritize 3-starring them over the Ziggs and Malphite. After that, you're going to add in 2 more Rebels, generally Master Yi and JINX. Gangplank is your late game win condition for this composition, as Ziggs 3 is meant to carry you through the mid game until you're able to find the Gangplank. Overall, this build is still effective despite the nerfs to Ziggs, but it's not not the most consistent. You must find 4 tiers to put double Seraphs on Ziggs, and you must 3-star them, otherwise this build falls off way too hard in the mid game. But if you're able to meet both of those requirements, Ziggs is going to do well enough to carry you into that late game. Alright, there's one last composition to talk about as an honorable mention, and that's Void Brawler. It looked like this build was going to fall off after the mana printer got nerfed in 1010, but players have been running it without the printer and instead making Kha'Zix a secondary carry alongside Vel'Koz. The core champions are all 4 brawlers, with Vel'Koz and Kha'Zix as the other 2 Void champions. Level 8, you either add in another sorcerer such as Lux or an infiltrator to boost your Kha'Zix. It is an option to roll for Kha'Zix 3, but don't prioritize doing that over leveling and finding Cho'Gath and Vel'Koz, as getting 3 Void is more important. Look to give Vel'Koz a tier item such as Seraph. Quicksilver is a must-have for Vel'Koz so that his ultimate isn't interrupted in the early parts of it. Morellonomicon is a fantastic third item to boost his damage and reduce the healing on enemy champions. Kha'Zix is flexible with his items, though Rapid Fire Cannon is common alongside damage items like Infinity Edge. Void Brawler is still being figured out, which is why it's an honorable mention, but it may become a staple of the meta within a few days as players get better and better at running the build. That is all we have for you for today, folks. As mentioned in the intro, this is by no means the only compositions you're going to see in the meta. There's many builds right now that are still being figured out, so the meta of today may look very different in a few days. Let us know in the comment section below which compositions you've been enjoying in patch 1010 and what upcoming builds you think will make it on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.